The good, the bad, and the faithful, going through the book of Genesis, yes. And we are reaching what really is the climax of the book of Genesis in the story of the life of Joseph. Joseph is someone who finally gets it. Now, many people have gotten it. They've understood what God was trying to speak to them throughout the book of Genesis. But a lot of those people didn't realize it till very late in life. It took Abraham till he was over 100 years old, really, to finally get it. What is faith? Somebody asked me this week, what does it mean to have faith in Jesus? That's a huge question. You can answer it very simply, and it might take you till you're past 100 to figure it out. It might. Joseph gets it as a teenager. We're going to see that today. As we go through the life of Joseph, I'm going to balance a couple of things. Number one, most of us probably know the story, so we're not going to go into details about every part of his story. But some of us won't know his story, and so we are going to give some overview and make sure that everybody can follow along. Another thing is, don't think that the life of Joseph has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with you and your life. What you're supposed to do during this time is listen to God, not particularly me, listen to the Word of God, and ask God, what is this telling me about my life and what I'm supposed to be seeing and understanding right now? There's a lot of history that I've been going into in some of these messages, and today we'll have a lot of history. The reason is because we need to understand what it was like for Joseph so that we can relate to him. Okay. So for illustration, the beginning, just a little bit of Joseph and archaeology. I'll do more next week, more Joseph and archaeology next week, but a little bit today to give you a few pieces. The story of Joseph, of course, he ends up becoming a ruler, not the ruler, but a ruler in the country of Egypt, which was a major world power at the time. And so there's always been a big question, like, is there archaeological evidence for Joseph and the Israelites being in Egypt? And the answer is a resounding yes and no. It is very complicated. But I'm just going to give you a few little pieces today. Here's some interesting tidbits. This is the Code of Hammurabi. Everybody say Hammurabi 3 times fast. Okay, not really. That's just a joke. But the Code of Hammurabi, this is a law code. It dates to about the time of the patriarchs. It's hard to say. There's lots of debate about when they actually lived. The patriarchs being Abraham and his son Isaac and his son Jacob and his 11th son Joseph. Up to about that time, it has tons of stuff in it. I'll just point out one thing it has in it. One thing it says in the Code of Hammurabi is that a slave should be purchased. It sets the price for a lot of different things. And it sets the price for male slaves by law at 20 shekels. Why is that important? Because at one point in Joseph's life, his brothers sell him as a slave. Guess how much they sell him for? 20 shekels. Interesting coincidence. This is kind of a big piece that's a big debate. So lots of Egyptologists say, if the Israelites really were in Egypt, where's the evidence for them? There's no inscription that says Joseph, ruler of Egypt, anywhere in Egypt. Of course, he had a different name, an Egyptian name that was given to him by Pharaoh, but that name's not found anywhere either. Is there any evidence for anything like this? We can't go into this too long, but this is really interesting. In about the same time as, again, there's some debate over the timeline, but in about the same time period as we would expect to see Joseph and the Israelites going into Egypt, there's a big upheaval in Egyptian history. And they had these other rulers who weren't Egyptians. They're called the Hyksos, which means the foreign rulers. And here's the earliest picture of a Hyksos ruler. Is there anything interesting that you would notice right away in this picture? It seems like this Hyksos ruler is a shepherd. He's got a gazelle that he is tending, a kind of goat. Isn't that interesting? What were Joseph and his brothers? What was their job? Now, it's not one-to-one. I'm going to give you a lot of the positive evidence. This is very complicated. I'll just say that, this history. Here's a few other interesting facts about the Hyksos. They were a Semitic people from Canaan. That's weird. Where were Joseph and his brothers from? They were rulers and they lived in the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta was known in antiquity as the land of Goshen. Where did Pharaoh settle? Joseph and his brothers. In the land of Goshen. Many of you would know that. Another interesting fact about these Hyksos rulers in Egypt is that they didn't actually invade Egypt. Somehow they became high-level rulers, maybe even equal to Pharaoh for a long time, but they didn't fight a war to do it. That's weird. How would someone become a ruler in Egypt without fighting a war? Maybe we should read the story of Joseph. They bring in new customs and new technology. Eventually, they are defeated by a pharaoh. There's actually wars between these Hyksos rulers, these Canaanite rulers, and the Egyptians, which we don't find anything like that in the Bible. So like I said, this is complicated. Josephus, an ancient historian, but way after Joseph, says flat out that the Hyksos were the Israelites. But we don't know. It's complicated. So is there evidence? There's a lot of evidence, but it's complex. I'll show you one more guy because I'm going to come back to this guy next week. I love this guy. This is Dr. Bob Breyer. He's at Long Island University. He's a very famous Egyptologist. He's also known as Mr. Mummy because he's famous for he actually mummified a human body in the Egyptian way, which takes 40 days to do with all Egyptian instruments. It's crazy. He did this as an experiment, and this mummy exists. You can go look this up. I listened through his entire university-level course on the history of ancient Egypt. It's amazing. It's amazing. He's got one chapter on Joseph, and mostly I'll show you some of the things he says about Joseph next week, because we'll do Joseph next week. We'll do Joseph part 2 next week. But I'll just show you one thing he says, a couple things he says about Joseph that are really interesting. You know Potiphar in the story of Joseph. We'll get to him in a minute. I haven't outlined the story yet, but this is an Egyptian ruler that Joseph gets sold as a slave to, a high Egyptian official. Potiphar, according to Dr. Bob Breyer and other Egyptologists, Potiphar is actually an Egyptian name. In Egyptian, it was pronounced a little bit different, Poti-Re, where Re is actually the sun god. You know, we often say it Ra. The Egyptians pronounced it Re. Re was the sun god. Pharaoh was the embodiment on earth of the sun god. So Potiphar is Poti-Re, which means given by Ra or given by Re. That's going to be important when we get back to that story. Okay, that's really interesting. And here's just an overall statement that Dr. Bob says about the story of Joseph. He says, the evidence is complicated. It's really hard to pin Joseph to any particular historical evidence in the archaeological record. But he says this, the story of Joseph as it's written in the Bible was very clearly written by someone who knew the land of Egypt. He says that's obvious to every Egyptologist who reads it. We'll go into some more of the details from him, which are about the second half of Joseph's life next week. Stay tuned for that. All right, so here's how we're going to do it today. We're going to jump through this here. We're going to jump into the outline of Joseph's life. What we're going to do today is really just look at the first half of his life up to the place where he's in prison, he's in a dungeon in Egypt, and 2 high officials of Pharaoh get sent into the dungeon with him. I'm going to give you an outline of the story of his whole life first, and then I'm going to give you all the points that are in your notes. If you're going to fill along, I'm going to give you all those points in succession. Because really, there's only one point that we're going to take out of Joseph's whole life. I'm going to say it in a whole bunch of different ways. It's the point that the whole book of Genesis has been trying to make, and it's a point about faith. What is faith? What does it mean to walk with God, to follow him, to believe in him? What does that actually mean? What does it look like? Joseph exemplifies that. He's not perfect, he's not sinless, he's not Jesus, but he is kind of a savior figure. In many ways, God is doing through him the kind of thing that God will eventually do for the whole world through Jesus himself. Okay, so let's look at the outline of his life, then all of those points, and then we're going to look at just a few snippets from some of the stories, some of the different moments in his life. Wow, this is going to be great. Okay, so here's Joseph's life. I told you during this part of the series, we are looking at an entire human life. An entire life, what God did with someone from the time they were little until the time that they left the earth. And so here's Joseph's life. He was young, and there's this scene where he has dreams as a teenager. Now there's a little bit from before that, We'll talk about that when we get there in a minute. We'll go over that today. His brothers all hated him. You might, if you have siblings, you might sometimes empathize or sympathize with him. So he has this scene where he has these dreams, and these dreams he knows are from God. And they're going to be about what God's going to do with his life. Is he going to trust God? The next scene is his brothers all betray him. They hate him because his dad loves him a lot more than he loves them. And they beat him up. They want to kill him, but then they say, no, let's get some money. So they sell him as a slave. 20 shekels they get for him. I actually don't know how much 20 shekels was compared to what, money today. I don't know. Maybe they get $100 for Joseph. Next, he's sent to Egypt, and he gets sold to Potiphar. We talked about him a minute ago, Poti Ray, the gift of Ray, the gift of Ra. He gets sold to this high official Potiphar, and he rises through the ranks in Potiphar's house, right? He's a slave, but he's given more and more responsibility by Potiphar until eventually he's running the whole house, and Potiphar just doesn't really have anything to do with his house, and his house would have been like, think a business in this case. Think like a corporation, because Potiphar had tons of slaves. He was a very powerful person, and Joseph is running the whole show. But then, of course, Potiphar's wife tries to get Joseph to sleep with her. Joseph won't do it. He doesn't even hesitate to risk everything in his life so that he can follow the right way, the way that he knows God is leading him. Amazing. Next, he's thrown into prison, and he doesn't get depressed in prison. There is no hint. I'm sure it wasn't fun for him, but there is no hint that Joseph is overwhelmed in prison, or that he is super depressed, or he thinks God has abandoned him. Not at all. No hint of it. He gets thrown into prison from really a high position, thrown back into prison, into a dungeon of Pharaoh, and he's not overcome by that. How? What if you could be like that? Wouldn't that be great? Something really bad comes into your life, and you're just like, I trust God perfectly. It's no problem. Wouldn't that be amazing? How does he get there? In the dungeon, of course, these high officials of Pharaoh are eventually sent into the dungeon. And as soon as the high officials of Pharaoh show up, Joseph is like, this is what I was waiting for. I knew this was going to happen. How does he know? He interprets their dreams. One of them is really bad. One of them is really good. One lives, one dies. They ignore him, though. They don't get him out of prison for a long time. Eventually, Pharaoh has dreams. All this part we'll look at next week. Pharaoh has dreams. He can't interpret his dreams. Why can't Pharaoh, the most powerful person maybe in the world at this point, why can none of his high officials interpret his dreams? So they pull Joseph up there. It's like an international emergency. Pharaoh had a dream, a national emergency. And so they pull Joseph up there, and Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dreams, and Pharaoh makes Joseph second in command of the nation of Egypt. Really? Did that really happen? Yeah, it did. It did happen. He goes around, the whole Egyptian nation they cry out, they bow down before him when he's on these processions through different towns. He collects all the grain. There's a story about a famine, 7 years of great harvests, and then 7 years of famine. Joseph saves the nation from starvation because of this. And then the final scene is his brothers coming down to Egypt to see him because they don't have any food either. And they come down to ask for food from Pharaoh. And who they meet is Joseph. They don't recognize him. He looks totally different. He is now one of the most powerful men in the world. And they all bow before him, just like his dreams showed when he was a teenager. They all bow before him. But Joseph doesn't even for a moment try to get revenge on his brothers. That's amazing. Why? How does he resist that temptation? Okay, he does mess with them. If you know the story, you know he messes with them a lot. But you can tell it's all friendly. The way that he messes with them is all very friendly. You can tell he loves them, even though they tried to kill him and sold him as a slave. And then he has this amazing line at the end, which is really the point of the whole book of Genesis in some ways, is that what you intended this for evil, but God intended it for good. You made choices that were evil, but God worked them all together for good. That's what he does. That's who he is. He's a way maker. He's a miracle worker. All right, so we're going to take a look at a few of these. Let's go through the points first. This is going to be all the points in your notes. Joseph gets it. Joseph is the one really in the book of Genesis who from a very young age understands the Lord is actually here with me and I can walk with him. And life is going to be a completely different kind of thing than if I tried to do it on my own. So here's a bunch of different ways to say the same thing. Joseph walks with God. This was a way it was expressed earlier in the book of Genesis. We saw this was what Adam did in the garden. He walked with God. And this is what some of the the people who first began to seek God after the fall, this is how they're described, as walking with God. It means you live your life with God, not just on your own, not thinking you're by yourself, but actually with the God who made you. Another way to say it is this: Joseph lets God be in control. He doesn't try to control his own life. He doesn't try to control the outcome of things. He works hard, he makes choices, but he recognizes that God directs his steps, always. And he allows that to be. Another way to say it is this: Joseph decides to let God lead his life. It's just a different way of saying the same thing. He says, you know what? I'm going to let you be in charge, not me. Even if you choose things that are not what I would have chosen, God, like being sold as a slave. Another way to say it is this: Joseph gives his life to God. I often use this kind of expression when I'm talking about coming to faith in Christ, right? Give your life to Jesus. Another way to say it is this: Joseph trusts God. He trusts him. Even when it looks like God is letting something bad happen, he says, I'm going to trust you anyway. You're the promise keeper. Joseph follows God. This is another way to put it. We often talk about this, following Jesus, following God, right? Joseph follows. He follows God's lead. He sees God initiating things in life and he says, okay, I'm going to go the way it seems like God is taking me. I'm not going to choose my own way. Another maybe interesting way, you might not have thought of it, and we're going to see this a lot in his story, Joseph learns from God. This is like what it means. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? It means that we learn from him. He's the master. We're the students. That's another way to translate the word disciple, is student. Joseph believes. This would be a really straightforward way. What does it mean to believe in God? To believe in Jesus? We're going to see this in Joseph's life. Okay, so let's jump into the text here. Now that we've got all that background, this painting I put up last week. This is Joseph's dad, right? This is Jacob, and this is Joseph's mom, Rachel. You remember this from last week? Beautiful painting. I actually kind of want this in my house, maybe. If I really like this painting. I don't know if my wife would like it, but hint. I really like this painting. It just really shows. So this is Joseph's parents. And Joseph's dad was way more into his mom than she was into him. You can see that in the picture. Rachel's life is actually kind of tragic. She doesn't seem like she really wanted maybe to marry Jacob. He kind of pushed for it. She went along with it anyway. She never really seemed to be able to accept God's lead in her life. She deceives. She's a manipulator. We saw that last week as well. She's a first-class manipulator. She's really good at it. Even at the end of her life, so she finally, after all this struggle with her sister, trying to compete with her sister to have children, she finally has a child of her own, not just through her slave girl. That child is Joseph. Then later on, quite a bit later, she has another kid. Her youngest child is Benjamin. And it really is tragic. She dies giving birth to Benjamin. And it seems like even at the end of her life, she is bitter. She doesn't name him Benjamin. She names him Ben-Oni, which means son of my trouble, son of my struggle, my trial. Rachel really is kind of like, you look at her life and she just never really sees that God is with her and God loves her and he's leading her. And she actually goes to her death bitter about how her life turned out. It's very sad. Jacob, we saw last week, has had a different experience. Actually, he wrestled with God. It eventually got real with God. He eventually gets it. Jacob gets it eventually. So as we enter into Genesis 37 with Joseph's story, where we're at is they're living in Canaan. They're back in Canaan. There's 12 brothers now. There's 12 sons. And Joseph's mom, Rachel, she's died. She's no longer with them. So Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. These are the two slave girls. And he brought their father a bad report about them. So this is the first thing we find in Joseph's life. He's 17 years old, and he's not getting along with his brothers. Now, I can't go into super detail on all this. I wish I could. There's so much history here. His brothers are not good guys. Most of them are not good guys. In fact, at one point, 2 of his brothers trick a local town and then massacre the entire town. Like full-on genocide. They kill everyone. This is the kind of brothers. I told you Genesis is like the Wild West. Joseph's brothers are a lot like a gang in the Wild West. I mean, this is like Jesse James' gang, maybe. Okay, so they're not good guys. When it says he brings his father a bad report about them, this is not just Joseph is jealous of his brothers or he's trying to get his brothers in trouble. His brothers are not good guys. Now Israel, so this is Jacob. Remember, Jacob got renamed. So this is Jacob. Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. Okay, now a couple of things here. This is part of the famous part about Joseph. If you know anything about Joseph, you probably know that he had what? A multicolored coat. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I guess he's just so famous for this because it's a really distinct, vivid line, right? Like Dad loved him so much, he gave him this special coat that looked really cool and nobody else had it. And it made his brothers really jealous. Now, there's a lot of debate about the translation of that. That's why it says an ornate robe here. A colored coat, colored cloak, a multicolored cloak. It can be translated a number of ways. You probably have always wished you knew what it looked like. Well, you might not know it, but actually they make shirts that look exactly like Joseph's coat. And we're going to have these guys come up and model. Come on, let's give them a round of applause. We'll just have a little break in the message. Get up here on the live stream for a second. Just jump up here. If you ever wanted to know what Joseph's multicolored coat looked like, now you know. All right, thank you guys. You guys can sit back down, chasing that neon rainbow, living that honky-tonk dream. Okay. Fantastic. So now you know what it looked like. But unlike us, where we're all happy for Adam and Chris that they have these coats, and we don't, we're very happy about that. His brothers were not happy. They got more and more jealous of Joseph. They didn't like him at all. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them. Now, I should say, often we give Jacob kind of a bad rap for this, right? You shouldn't love one of your kids more than the other, should you? No, you shouldn't. If you're a parent, make sure you don't do that. And it is a little bit bad, but you can understand, we don't know exactly what Jacob acted like. We know he gave him this coat, but we don't know exactly what this looked like. And you can understand it, right? The person he loved, his true love was who? It was Rachel. And this is Rachel's son. Rachel's gone. You can empathize with Jacob, why he loves Joseph so much. But his brothers hate him, and they can't speak a kind word to him. And then this crazy thing happens where Joseph has these 2 dreams, okay? The first one is about sheaves of wheat. This is a painting by Van Gogh, Sheaves of Wheat, 1890. This is what sheaves of wheat are. Big stacks of standing grain. So the grain is at the top, and then it's like a long piece of grass, right? And they're all bundled together. They're cut and bundled together. So here's the first dream that Joseph has. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. Let's just pause there for a second. When you read this dream, you're going to need to ask yourself, why does Joseph tell his brothers the dream? Is he crazy? They already hate him, right? And this is the dream he tells them. Hey, guys, listen to this. I had this dream. I had this dream, and in the dream, all of us, all 12 of us, were binding sheaves of grain out in the field. And suddenly my sheaf rose up, and it stood straight up. It stood upright, while all of your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Why in the world would he tell his brothers this dream? Is he totally naive? We debated this in Bible study this morning. Is he totally naive and just doesn't realize they're going to hate him even more? I don't think so. Why does he tell them the dream? Is he messing with them? Is he trying? Sometimes brothers fight with each other, right? And do things to push each other's buttons. Is he trying to get them to be mad at him? I don't think so. He knows his brothers are not to be messed with, actually. He knows some of his brothers have murdered an entire town. I don't think he's just messing with them. Let's see if we can get this bad gang of outlaws to come kill me. No, I don't think so. I think there's another reason. We'll leave it there for now. But he tells them this dream. And what do they think as soon as they hear this? His brothers say to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Are you saying you're going to be our ruler? Will you actually rule us?" So they hate him even more, right? Now they're really ready to kill him, okay? Because of this dream and what he had said. Now, as if this weren't bad enough, he has another dream that's very similar. And he tells it to his family again. Now you know he can't be naive. It's not because he's naive. He already knows that he told them one dream and they got really mad at him. Here's the second dream. Oh, this is just an image. This is not from the Near East, but it is from the Bronze Age, about the same time as Joseph. This is called the Nebra sky disk. Isn't that thing cool? That thing's super cool. Found in Germany, actually. It shows the sun and the moon and the stars. Here's the dream. Joseph had another dream. And he told it to his brothers because he's out of his mind. He said, "Listen, I had another dream, guys. Don't you want to hear it? This time, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." How many brothers does Joseph have? How many brothers does he have? 11. The sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. When he told this to his father and his brothers, he tells dad too this time. And his father rebukes him. His father, who loves him more than all the rest, he's the special child. His father rebukes him. "What is this dream you had? Are you crazy? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? You think that's really going to happen?" It's a dream. His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Now that's interesting. That's really interesting. Okay. Before we move on, let me point out a couple of things. These dreams are not exactly the same. All right? Joseph is paying attention to what's going on. He is paying attention to his dreams. I think it's clear as we go through the rest of the story of his life, Joseph knows that these dreams are from the Lord. These are not just ordinary dreams. He knows they're from God, and he knows that they are showing him something about what God's going to do in his life and about his future, about what's going to happen in the future. There's several things. I think maybe it takes him quite a long time to fully understand how to interpret these dreams, but I think he gets a few things right away. Number one, I think if we go back to this first dream, okay? This first dream, binding sheaves of grain. What happens after you bind those sheaves? Like in the process of grain, right? They're trying to make bread. That's what they're trying to do if you're binding sheaves. So you cut the grain down, you bind it up into these bundles, and then what do you do with it? The next thing you do is thresh it. You take it out and you beat it with a stick until all the grain comes off. And then you winnow it. You throw it up in the air and the chaff blows away. Now, I'm not 100% sure that this is where Joseph's thinking went, but I think he interprets these dreams to mean that he's about to suffer greatly. I think that because of how he acts next and how he acts every time suffering comes into his life. Every time suffering comes into his life, he acts like he already knew it was coming. And it's no surprise to him. It's no surprise to God. I think he sees that not only is he eventually going to save the family in some ways. This one is actually probably not about him ruling. It's about him what is the grain eventually going to be used to make? Bread, right? Eventually, his family is going to be literally starving to death, and he's going to be the one who saves them with grain. We know the end of the story. He doesn't know it yet. But I think this one is mostly about provision. It's about he's going to be the one who provides for them. But his brothers see this and think, oh, no, we're going to kill you. You're just such I can't stand you. Okay? I think it means he knows he's going to suffer as well. What if God gave you a vision and told you were going to suffer, but he was going to do amazing things through you in the end? Would you trust him? The second one, there's a question here, okay? He has a dream. The sun and the moon and the 11 stars bow down to him. It's very clear that the 11 stars are his brothers. And most people would think, actually most pastors I would think this. I don't, but who are the sun and the moon? What do those represent in the dream? What does Jacob think? He thinks it's him and mom. Who's mom? What mom are we talking about at this point? Not Rachel. Rachel's not alive. Joseph's mom's not even there. We're talking about Leah. He thinks it's him and Leah. That's who's left. I don't think so. I don't think so because we know the rest of the story. We know, in fact, that his 11 brothers do come to Egypt and they do bow before him. That actually happens in the story. Jacob never bows before him. That never happens in the rest of Genesis. And Leah never even goes to Egypt. She dies before the family goes to Egypt. There is no moon to come and bow down to him. What does it mean then? What country is Joseph going to become this great ruler of? Which country? Egypt. Who is the leader of Egypt? The Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was believed to be the embodiment of a particular god. Do you know which one? The sun. Ray on earth. And the second, perhaps the second most powerful god in the Egyptian pantheon was, guess which one? The moon. The moon often represented the people of Egypt. I think it's the Pharaoh and the people of Egypt. I think that's what the dream means. I don't think Joseph knows it yet. And I could be wrong. I'll tell you, I could be wrong. Bible doesn't say that. Doesn't say it flat out. Next, Joseph is sold as a slave. His brothers had gone to graze their flocks near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, as you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. And right there, I know probably, I don't know if any of you can see it yet. That's faith. That is the secret of Joseph's entire life. Why? His brothers had gone to graze the flocks near Shechem. What do we know about Joseph's brothers at this point? Do they like him or not like him? They don't like him. And dad is about to send him to the brothers that don't like him. Maybe want to kill him. Do you think he knows that? He knows it. Not only that, where are the brothers, where do they have their flocks right at this point where dad sends him? Shechem. Now you would have to know your Bible pretty well, but I told you before that 2 of his brothers had massacred an entire city. Guess what city? Shechem. Joseph knows from his dreams that he's about to suffer. I'm convinced of it. He knows he's about to suffer and it's going to come soon. And then one day dad comes to him and says, Joseph, I'm going to send you to check on your brothers. Where are they? They're in Shechem, the place where they murder people. What is Joseph's response? Very well. The Hebrew here, what he actually says is, here I am. It's the same thing Isaiah says in the temple when God calls him. Here I am. It's a response to God. I don't even think he's responding to his dad. He sees that God is now bringing this thing to pass in his life. He's going to suffer immensely, but eventually God's going to use it for good. He says, Lord, here I am. I will let you lead my life. Even if it costs me. I don't even know what it's going to cost me. I'm going to let you do it. It gets even better. He said, go see if everything's well with your brothers. This is what Jacob says to him. And bring word back to me. He sent him off into the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They've moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. I don't have time to go into all the details, but there's some very, very interesting things in the Hebrew text at this point. Does this remind you of anything? He's wandering around the fields of a town that was massacred, okay? So nobody lives there, and he runs into just some random person, some random guy who he doesn't know, who happens to know where his brothers are. There was a time Joseph's dad, Jacob, ran into a person he didn't know. Do you remember that story? In Jacob's case, he wrestled with that guy all night. That guy turned out to be an angel. Many people think that what happens here and what Genesis is telling us is that he ran into an angel in the fields of Shechem. Someone that he doesn't know where this guy came from and who tells him, he has this conversation, basically a conversation about, are you going to accept what God's bringing into your life? What are you looking for, Joseph? I'm looking for my brothers. I'm going to accept what God's bringing into my life. Can you tell me where they are? I can tell you. Go ahead. Walk into what God has prepared for you. Oh, man. This is a really cool old painting, 1485. That's kind of old. I don't know. It's an Italian painting. It's the story of Joseph's life. There aren't too many famous paintings of the story of Joseph's life, but here's the scene. What happens next? We won't read it, but he walks up to his brothers. This is the brothers. When he finally finds them, they got the sheep. Here's Joseph walking up to the brothers. What happens is that they decide that they want to kill him, and they argue about it. One of his brothers talks him out of it. Let's not kill him. Let's just throw him in a pit, okay? We'll just throw him in a pit. We're going to skip over that. So they throw him in this pit. They beat him up. They take his coat. They throw him in a pit. Why do they take his coat? That's the thing it's like the symbol of their jealousy of him. They throw him in a cistern. He's down there for a while. Eventually, they come up with this idea that they can get 20 shekels for him if they sell him. And so they do. They sell him to some passing merchants. And then this is the scene in this painting of the merchants. They're getting him on, this is the merchanti, the merchants, and they're putting him on their boat. You can see this is all done up in a very Middle Ages Italian style. They're putting him on the boat to Egypt. They take him down to sell him in Egypt. This is the brothers. They go back to Jacob, and they bring him Joseph's coat. They've torn it to pieces, and they put a bunch of blood on it so that it looks like they say, we found this. I don't know where Joseph is, but we found this coat all mangled. And Dad, of course, thinks that he is dead, and he's heartbroken for a long, long time. That's the kind of brothers he has. All right. Next, we have the scene at Potiphar's house. We'll wrap up pretty soon here. Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. This is like a special, he's promoted again and again. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. So this is like the owner of the company basically lets you run it. You are the boss. He becomes this high official in Potiphar's household. From the time he put him in charge of his household and of all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. Joseph was well built and handsome. The next scene is the wife trying to get Joseph into bed. But we can see what happens here. There's really only one thing I want to point out in the story of Potiphar, and that is his name. All right? Joseph has got in the back of his mind, God has got a plan for his life. He's gone into this time of great suffering. This cannot have been a fun experience for him, being betrayed by his own brothers, beaten up, seeing that they want to kill him, and then being sold as a slave. Just think about for a second what kinds of things that might have involved. This is a horrible life, but he's got in the back of his mind all of this stuff that God has promised him. And one of those visions is that the 11 stars and the sun and the moon are eventually going to bow down to him. And like we said before, now Joseph is in the land of the sun god. This must have connected in his brain. It had to. We'll see that when we get to some of the stuff about the interpretation of dreams next week. It had to have connected in his mind. God said, the sun and the moon were going to bow down to me, and now I am in the land of the sun and the moon. And then he gets sold to a guy whose name is given by the sun god, whose name is Sun, Potirah. And then, as time goes on, he watches God's promise come to pass in his life, first in a small way. You can see that Potiphar really, in some ways, bows down to Joseph, not literally, but he gives Joseph more and more responsibility until eventually Joseph is basically the ruler of the household. Everything is under his authority, except for Potiphar himself. Amazing. He must have seen this as a fulfillment of his dream. I think there's really no other way around it in my mind. I think he probably also saw, in this moment, he probably saw what happens with the wife maybe even as a partial fulfillment, right? The sun and the moon. Joseph was well-built and handsome. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you. I skipped the part where she tries to seduce him. But she tries to seduce him. She tries over and over and over again for a long time. She really likes Joseph. And he says no. He responds almost instantaneously. No, instantaneously. It's almost as if he is immune to the temptation. I mean, think about this. How does Joseph resist this temptation? This is part of what it means to walk with God. The whole time throughout his life, Joseph has got his eyes fixed on the one who's walking with him. He knows that God started this thing off. He knows that God has been with him in this. He sees that the position he's gotten into. Joseph is not thinking at this moment that he achieved this great thing with his own power. He can't be. Because if that's what he were thinking, he would have given in to this temptation. Think about it for a minute. If you're in this position, you're thinking, yeah, I'm the ruler of this household because I'm so amazing. If that was the thought, he would have thought, oh, well, now this woman wants to sleep with me? Well, that's because I'm so amazing. Let's go with that. No. Joseph knows that all of this is only because of God's hand in his life. And because of that, the temptation isn't even a temptation. He's not about to sin against God, because if he sins against God, everything's going to go away. Nothing that he has is given to him by himself. He didn't do it with his own power. It's all from God. He's constantly walking with God. He's got his eyes fixed on God. He's living his life for God. He trusts God. This is how he lives. All right, guys, we got to wrap up. But I'll just say a couple things about the dungeon dreams, and then we'll talk about them a little bit more next week. The wife sets him up. When he eventually won't sleep with her, she tries to grab him and make him, which is a crazy thing to think about. He runs away and she gets his cloak. Once again, there's a cloak involved. It's a different one. Weird. And she goes to her husband and she says, this guy tried to rape me. And so he gets thrown in jail. He loses everything. And there is no indication in the text that Joseph falters even for a minute. Even in the dungeon, he knows that God is still going to be with him, and God is going to eventually do the same thing again. He's going to fulfill these dreams. And sometime later in the dungeon, he rises up through the ranks in the dungeon. He eventually becomes the overseer of the prison. This is a crazy thing. And then eventually he sees the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt. They offend their master, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was angry with these two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in the custody of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was. And the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph. Now we'll leave it here on a to be continued note, but what is Joseph thinking at this moment? Eventually the sun and the moon will bow down to him. He knows. He's been put in prison once again. He's not sure what God's going to do next, but all of a sudden he sees two high-level officials put in his own custody. He has authority over them, even though he's a prisoner. And whose officials are they? They're the officials of the sun god. Even in the prison, he's been given authority over the god of Egypt in some sense. And we're going to see what he does with that later. Let's pray. We'll continue in worship.